The moving truck pulled away from the curb, leaving Michael and Linda Chen standing in front of their new home in Sycamore Hills. After months of searching, they had finally found a single-story house that could work for their needs. Michael leaned on his cane and took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled at his wife. "Home sweet home," he said, reaching for Linda's hand. She squeezed his fingers and nodded. "It's perfect." They had spent the last 30 years moving from place to place during Michael's military career. Now at 62, Michael's body carried the weight of his service. A helicopter crash during his final tour had left him with a spinal injury that was gradually reducing his mobility. The doctors had been clear. He would eventually need a wheelchair full-time. That reality had pushed them to find a forever home that could accommodate his changing needs. "Let's go inside before you get too tired," Linda said, noticing the slight tremor in Michael's hand. The moving process had been exhausting for him, though he'd never admit it. As they walked up the driveway, Michael moved slowly, each step deliberate. The 3 front steps presented a challenge, and Linda hovered nearby as he gripped the handrail and pulled himself up. It took nearly a minute to climb what most people could manage in seconds. "We'll get that ramp built soon," Linda whispered, a promise they both knew was essential. Inside, cardboard boxes formed miniature skyscrapers in every room. Their new home was modest but well-maintained, with wide doorways that had been a major selling point. The previous owners had renovated the bathroom with grab bars and a walk-in shower, features that had made Michael and Linda feel like the universe was nudging them toward this house. "I'll get some lunch started," Linda said. "Why don't you rest for a bit?" Michael shook his head. "I want to meet the neighbors while I'm still vertical." His attempt at humor couldn't hide his underlying concern. His good days were becoming less frequent, and they both knew it. The neighborhood seemed picture-perfect, with neatly trimmed lawns and tasteful landscaping. American flags fluttered from several porches, a familiar sight that made Michael feel a connection to his new community. He had served his country for decades, and seeing those flags felt like a welcome home. Their next-door neighbor was out watering flowers, a stocky man with salt and pepper hair who introduced himself as Joe Perez. He immediately put down his watering can and walked over to greet them. "Welcome to Sycamore Hills. We saw the moving truck earlier. Military family, right?" Joe gestured toward the army cap Michael wore. "That obvious, huh?" Michael laughed. "Retired Army helicopter pilot. Air Force myself, but I won't hold the Army thing against you." Joe grinned, extending his hand. 22 years. Got out in '08. They chatted easily about their service, and Joe's wife Diane joined them, bringing over homemade cookies. They were the kind of neighbors Michael and Linda had hoped to find. Friendly, straightforward people who understood the military lifestyle. "Fair warning about the HOA," Joe said, lowering his voice slightly. "They're pretty strict around here. Keep your grass cut, trash cans hidden, and don't even think about changing your exterior paint color without permission." "Every place has rules," Michael shrugged. After decades of military discipline, a homeowners association didn't seem particularly intimidating. "This one's a bit different," Diane added, her expression turning serious. "The president, Elaine Winters, she's been running things for years. Real stickler for the rules, especially with new folks." "I'm sure we'll be fine," Linda said. "We're pretty low-key people." Joe and Diane exchanged a look that Michael couldn't quite interpret. "Just make sure you read all the bylaws," Joe advised. "All 600 pages of them." 600 pages? Linda's eyes widened. "For a neighborhood association? Elaine adds a new rule every time someone does something she doesn't like," Diane explained. "Last year, the Thompsons put up a basketball hoop for their kids. Within a week, there was a new rule about recreational equipment visibility from the street." As they continued talking, a silver Mercedes pulled into the driveway of a large 2-story house across the street. A woman in her 50s emerged, dressed in an expensive-looking pantsuit despite the weekend. Her blonde hair was styled in a perfect bob, not a strand out of place. "That's her," Joe whispered. "Elaine Winters, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood sheriff." The woman looked over at them, her gaze lingering on the moving boxes visible through their open garage. Her expression tightened as if the mere sight of cardboard offended her. Instead of coming over to introduce herself, she opened her mailbox, collected her mail, and walked briskly inside. "Don't take it personally," Diane said. "She's like that with everyone at first. Actually, she's like that with everyone, period. That evening, as Michael and Linda unpacked their kitchen, the doorbell rang. Linda answered to find a thin woman with a tight smile holding a thick binder. "Hello, I'm Patricia Collins, HOA secretary. Welcome to Sycamore Hills." Her voice was cheerful, but her eyes were assessing everything visible from the doorway. "I've brought your copy of the community guidelines and bylaws. Every homeowner is required to read and sign the acknowledgement form within 7 days of moving in." Linda took the heavy binder, thanking Patricia while feeling slightly overwhelmed by its weight. "We have a monthly meeting this Wednesday at 7 p.m. in the community center," Patricia continued. "New homeowners are strongly encouraged to attend." The way she said strongly encouraged made it clear this was not optional. After Patricia left, Linda dropped the binder on the kitchen counter with a thud. 600 pages, she muttered. Joe wasn't kidding. Michael flipped through the first few sections, eyebrows rising at the level of detail. Rules about acceptable mailbox designs, approved shades of white for window trim, and even restrictions on what kinds of plants could be visible from the street. "Listen to this," he said. "Holiday decorations may be displayed no earlier than 30 days before the holiday, and must be removed within 7 days after. Christmas lights must be white only, no colored lights permitted." He shook his head in disbelief. "These people need a hobby," Linda said, pulling out dishes to arrange in their new cabinets. The next morning, Michael woke early, his back stiff from the previous day's activities. He moved carefully to the kitchen, making coffee while looking out at their new neighborhood in the soft dawn light. Their house had good bones, as Linda liked to say, but it would need modifications to work for him long term. The front steps were the most urgent issue. He was sketching ideas for a wheelchair ramp on a notepad when he noticed a figure standing at the edge of their property. Elaine Winters was examining their mailbox with a frown, taking photos with her phone. When she saw Michael watching through the window, she didn't wave or smile. Instead, she made a show of checking her watch and pointing to a garbage can they'd left at the curb after the previous evening's unpacking. Michael opened the front door, balancing carefully with his cane. "Good morning," he called, his voice carrying across the lawn. "We're the Chens, I'm Michael." Elaine approached but stopped several feet from the steps, her posture rigid. Up close, he could see the careful application of her makeup and the expensive jewelry that adorned her wrists and fingers. "Mr. Chen, I'm Elaine Winters, president of the Sycamore Hills Homeowners Association." Her tone was cool and professional. "I noticed your trash can is at the curb. According to Section 17 of our bylaws, trash receptacles may only be placed at the curb after 6 p.m. the evening before collection and must be removed by 8 p.m. on collection day." Michael blinked, taken aback by this greeting. "We just moved in yesterday. We're still getting settled. Rules apply to everyone, regardless of how long they've lived here," Elaine replied. "Also, I noticed your mailbox is the incorrect shade of black. The approved color is midnight onyx, not raven black. You'll need to repaint it within 14 days. Before Michael could respond, Elaine handed him a printed violation notice. "Consider this a friendly reminder. We pride ourselves on maintaining certain standards in Sycamore Hills." As she walked away, Michael stood there holding the notice, wondering what kind of place they had moved into. He hadn't even had his first cup of coffee yet, and he was already breaking rules he didn't know existed. When Linda joined him in the kitchen, he showed her the notice. "She actually measured the shade of black on our mailbox," he said, half amused, half concerned. "Who does that?" "Someone with way too much time on her hands," Linda replied, pouring herself coffee. Over the next few days, they settled into a routine, unpacking and arranging their new home. Several neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves, most bringing small gifts or offers of help. Almost everyone included some variation of, "Watch out for the HOA and they're welcome." Michael had started researching contractors who could build a wheelchair ramp for the front entrance. His doctor had been cleared during his last appointment. His condition was progressing faster than they'd initially thought. The cane would soon give way to a walker and eventually a wheelchair. They needed to be prepared. "I found a company that specializes in accessibility modifications," he told Linda one evening, showing her a website on his tablet. "They can design something that works with the house style, so hopefully even Elaine won't find it objectionable." "It's a necessary medical modification," Linda said firmly. Even the strictest HOA can't refuse that. Michael nodded, but he couldn't shake a feeling of unease. There was something about Elaine Winters that suggested she wouldn't make anything easy for them, necessary or not. "We'll submit all the proper paperwork," he said. "Follow their process to the letter. She can't say no to that." As the sun set on their first week in Sycamore Hills, Michael and Linda sat on their back patio, enjoying the peace of their new home. Despite the HOA concerns, they felt hopeful about the community they were joining. Most of their neighbors had been welcoming, and they could handle one difficult HOA president. What they couldn't possibly know was that Elaine Winters was already discussing them at an impromptu HOA board meeting in her living room, where she referred to Michael's planned modifications as the beginning of turning our exclusive community into a medical facility. The battle lines were being drawn before they even knew they were at war. The Wednesday night HOA meeting arrived faster than Michael and Linda had anticipated. Between unpacking boxes and setting up their new home, they'd barely had time to skim through the massive binder of rules Patricia had dropped off. Still, they knew attending was important to make a good impression on their new neighbors. The community center was a small brick building at the entrance to Sycamore Hills. Inside, about 30 residents sat in neatly arranged folding chairs. Michael felt eyes turning toward them as Linda helped him navigate the narrow space between chairs. His leg was particularly troublesome tonight, and he leaned heavily on his cane. "New folks in the back," a sharp voice called out. Elaine Winters stood at the front of the room behind a portable podium, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "We've already started." Michael and Linda found seats in the back row, painfully aware of the whispers their entrance had caused. The meeting agenda covered typical neighborhood concerns, landscaping contracts, plans for replanting the entrance flower beds, and a lengthy discussion about the appropriate height for hedges. "Next item," Elaine announced, checking her printed agenda. "New homeowner introductions." She looked up, her gaze finding Michael and Linda immediately. "We have the Chens joining us from—" She paused, consulting her notes with exaggerated care. "I believe you were military?" Michael stood, balancing carefully on his cane. "Yes, that's right. I'm Michael Chen, retired Army helicopter pilot. This is my wife, Linda. We're happy to be settling down in Sycamore Hills after moving around for most of my career." A few residents nodded politely. Joe Perez gave them a thumbs up from across the room. "Mr. Chen," Elaine said, her tone clipped, "I trust you've had time to review our community guidelines? The violation notice regarding your garbage can placement has been resolved, but I noticed your mailbox remains the incorrect shade." Before Michael could respond, Linda stood up beside him. "We've ordered the correct paint and we'll take care of it this weekend," she said, her voice calm despite the tension Michael could feel radiating from her. "We're still getting settled in." "Very good," Elaine replied with a thin smile. Moving on to committee reports. The meeting dragged on for another hour. When it finally ended, several neighbors came over to introduce themselves properly, offering sympathetic smiles and whispered advice about dealing with the HOA board. "Don't let Elaine get to you," an older woman named Rose told them. "She treats everyone this way at first. It's her way of establishing dominance. Like a dog marking territory," Joe added, joining them. "Except with violation notices instead of, well, you know." The laughter broke some of the tension and Michael found himself relaxing slightly. Not everyone in Sycamore Hills was like Elaine. There were good people here too. As they were leaving, Michael noticed the community center had a small set of steps at its entrance. No ramp in sight. The oversight wasn't lost on him as his leg twinged with pain while navigating the stairs. "That's the first thing we need to deal with," he told Linda once they were in the car. "I don't want to wait until things get worse." The next morning, Michael called the accessibility company they'd researched. A representative named Tom arranged to visit their home the following day to assess their needs and discuss options. When Tom arrived, he turned out to be a former Marine with a comprehensive knowledge of AD requirements. He walked the property with Michael, taking measurements and photos. "What we're looking at is a modular aluminum ramp system," Tom explained, showing Michael designs on his tablet. "It's durable, won't rust, and can be customized to match your home's exterior. We can powder coat it in any color you choose." "Our HOA is pretty strict," Michael cautioned. "The design needs to look as unobtrusive as possible." I've dealt with plenty of HOAs, Tom assured him. We'll make it blend with your home's aesthetic. I'll draw up plans that even the pickiest board member would have trouble objecting to. Over the next week, Tom sent detailed architectural plans that included landscaping to partially screen the ramp from street view. The design was elegant and thoughtful, preserving the home's character while providing the access Michael needed. This looks perfect, Linda said, reviewing the final proposal. I can't see how anyone could object to this. Michael nodded, but a knot of anxiety had formed in his stomach. Let's get the HOA paperwork submitted right away. I have a doctor's appointment next month and my condition isn't getting any better. The HOA modification request form was buried in Section 42 of the Community Guidelines. It required detailed plans, contractor information, material specifications, color samples, and a processing fee of $150. Michael and Linda carefully compiled everything, even including a letter from Michael's doctor explaining the medical necessity of the modification. Linda hand-delivered the complete package to Patricia Collins, the HOA secretary, who lived 3 doors down. I'll make sure this gets to the board right away, Patricia promised, her eyes scanning the thick envelope. Though I should warn you, modification requests typically take 4 to 6 weeks to process. That seems like a long time for a medical necessity, Linda frowned. Rules are rules, Patricia replied with an apologetic shrug, but I'll mention the urgency to Elaine. 2 weeks passed with no word about their application. Michael called Patricia twice, only to be told the board was still reviewing their request. Meanwhile, his mobility continued to decline. A particularly bad fall in the shower had left him with a nasty bruise on his hip, reinforcing the urgency of their situation. This is ridiculous, Linda fumed after Michael's third call to Patricia ended with another vague response. You're a disabled veteran who needs access to your own home. What's there to review for weeks on end? The next day, Linda took matters into her own hands and called Elaine directly. The conversation was brief and unsatisfying. Mrs. Chen, the board reviews all requests in the order they're received, Elaine explained, her voice coolly professional. We cannot make exceptions even for special circumstances. My husband's disability is not a special circumstance, Linda replied, struggling to keep her voice level. It's a federally protected right under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm well aware of federal law, Mrs. Chen, Elaine responded, but our community has standards that all residents agreed to maintain when they purchase their homes. Your application will be processed according to our established procedures. The line went dead before Linda could respond further. That evening, their doorbell rang. Joe Perez stood on their porch looking uncomfortable. I heard about your ramp application, he said once Linda had invited him in. My wife is friends with Patricia's sister. Word gets around. Michael nodded, unsurprised. Small communities had their own information networks. Look, Joe continued, lowering his voice slightly. You should know that Elaine has a history with these kinds of requests. 3 years ago, a family with a child who used a wheelchair tried to install a ramp. Elaine dragged out the process for months until they eventually gave up and sold their house. That's discrimination, Linda said, her face flushing with anger. Of course it is, Joe agreed, but Elaine's clever about it. She never explicitly denies these requests based on disability. It's always about property values or neighborhood aesthetics or some other subjective standard that's hard to fight. So what do we do? Michael asked, feeling a weight settling onto his shoulders. Document everything, Joe advised. Every call, every email. Get things in writing whenever possible. And maybe consult a lawyer who specializes in housing discrimination. After Joe left, Michael and Linda sat at their kitchen table, the implications of his warning sinking in. I never thought we'd have to fight for something as basic as access to our own home, Michael said quietly. Linda reached across the table to take his hand. If it's a fight they want, it's a fight they'll get. Tomorrow I'm calling every board member individually, and if that doesn't work, we'll find a lawyer. The next 3 weeks brought more delays and vague responses. Linda called every member of the HOA board, but most either didn't return her calls or deferred to Elaine's authority. Their applications seemed to be trapped in a bureaucratic limbo, designed to test their patience and resolve. Finally, 6 weeks after they'd submitted their application, an official HOA letter arrived in their mailbox. Linda opened it at the kitchen table, Michael watching her face as she read. They denied it, she said, her voice tight with disbelief. Listen to this. After careful consideration, the Sycamore Hills Homeowners Association Board has determined that the proposed modification would significantly alter the architectural character of the neighborhood and potentially impact property values negatively. Your request to install an exterior ramp is therefore denied. Michael took the letter from her trembling hands. Below the formal rejection was a handwritten note in elegant script. Perhaps you should consider a community better suited to your special needs. E.W. The dismissive tone of the note made Michael's face burn with a mixture of anger and humiliation. After 30 years of military service, after putting his body on the line for his country, he was being told his basic need for access was a problem, an inconvenience to people like Elaine Winters. What do we do now? Linda asked, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. Michael folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. His military training had taught him that the most important battles often weren't won by brute force, but by strategy and determination. We get a lawyer, he said decisively, and we find out exactly what the Fair Housing Act has to say about reasonable accommodations for disabilities. That evening, Michael made a call to his old Army buddy, Paul Kim, who had become a civil rights attorney after leaving the service. This is textbook discrimination. Michael, Paul said after hearing the situation, the Fair Housing Act is very clear on this. Homeowners associations cannot prevent reasonable modifications for people with disabilities, period. Send me everything you have and I'll draft a letter that will make this Elaine person think twice about messing with a disabled veteran. For the first time since moving to Sycamore Hills, Michael felt a sense of hope. They weren't powerless in this fight. There were laws to protect people like him, and it was time Elaine Winters learned that her HOA rulebook didn't trump federal law. Tomorrow, he told Linda as they prepared for bed, we start pushing back. Paul Kim wasted no time getting to work on the Chen's case. Within 3 days, he had drafted a formal legal letter citing multiple violations of the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act. The letter explained in clear terms that the HOA's denial of a medically necessary modification was unlawful, and it gave the board 14 days to reverse their decision before legal action would be taken. This should get their attention, Paul explained as he forwarded a copy of the letter to Michael and Linda. I've sent it by certified mail so they can't claim they never received it. Michael felt a weight lift from his shoulders as he read through the document. Paul had outlined their case clearly, backing up each point with specific legal citations. It was a masterful piece of legal writing that left no room for misinterpretation. What happens if they ignore this? Linda asked during their video call with Paul. Then we file a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development and potentially a lawsuit in federal court, Paul explained. But most HOAs back down once they realize they're violating federal law. No one wants the expense of fighting a losing battle. 3 days later, the certified letter was delivered to Elaine Winters. By that afternoon, the neighborhood grapevine was buzzing with news. Joe Perez stopped by with an update. Elaine called an emergency board meeting for tonight, he reported. She's furious. Apparently, she told Patricia that no one threatens her with lawyers and gets away with it. Michael shook his head. This isn't a threat. It's just making her aware of the law. To Elaine, it's the same thing, Joe replied. She's not used to people standing up to her. The following day, Patricia Collins appeared at their door, her usual tight smile replaced by a nervous expression. The board asked me to deliver this, she said, handing over an envelope before quickly retreating to her car without further comment. Inside was a single-page letter, coldly formal in its wording. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Chen, the Sycamore Hills HOA acknowledges receipt of your legal correspondence dated April 15th. The board will require additional time to consult with our attorney regarding this matter. We will provide a formal response within 30 days. Until then, your modification request remains denied, and any construction attempted without approval will result in immediate fines of $500 per day and potential legal action. Sincerely, the Sycamore Hills HOA Board. At the bottom was Elaine's signature, the elaborate flourish seeming to mock them. They're stalling, Linda said angrily, tossing the letter onto the counter. 30 more days when they've already had 6 weeks to review our application? Michael forwarded the letter to Paul, who called back within the hour. This is a typical delay tactic, Paul confirmed. They're hoping you'll give up or that your situation will become so difficult you'll move. But they've actually done us a favor by putting their continued denial in writing. So what do we do now? Michael asked, feeling the frustration build inside him. Just that morning, he'd slipped on the front steps and nearly fallen. His doctor had told him at his last appointment that he should start using a walker regularly, which would make the steps even more dangerous. We have two options, Paul explained. We can wait out their 30 days and then escalate if they continue to deny, or... He paused. Based on my experience with similar cases, we could proceed with installing the ramp under the protection of the Fair Housing Act. The law is very clear that you have the right to make reasonable modifications for disability access. If we do that, they'll fine us, Linda pointed out. They can try, Paul replied, but any fines would be unenforceable. The courts have repeatedly struck down HOA penalties for disability accommodations. I can't promise it won't get messy, but legally, you're on solid ground. Michael and Linda discussed their options late into the night. The next morning, Michael's leg gave out completely as he attempted to navigate the front steps. Linda barely caught him before he tumbled backward. That's it, she said firmly, helping him inside. We're building the ramp. I'm not risking your safety another day. They called Tom from the accessibility company, who agreed to start construction the following week. When Linda explained their situation, Tom was sympathetic. We've dealt with difficult HOAs before, he assured them. I'll make sure everything is built to code and ADA standards. If they try to interfere, they'll be interfering with a federally protected right. Word spread quickly through Sycamore Hills. Several neighbors stopped by to offer their support, though others kept their distance, unwilling to get on Elaine's bad side. Rose, an elderly woman from down the street, brought over a homemade casserole. My late husband used a wheelchair his last 3 years, she told them. I know what you're going through. Don't let that woman bully you. The day construction began, Elaine Winters appeared at the edge of their property, phone in hand, taking photos and making notes. She didn't approach or speak to them, but her presence felt like a threat. By lunchtime, Patricia had delivered another violation notice with a $500 fine for unauthorized exterior modifications. Linda placed it with the growing file of documentation they were keeping for Paul. Construction proceeded quickly. Tom and his crew worked efficiently, completing most of the ramp in just 2 days. The design was tasteful, with the aluminum frame powder-coated in a color that matched their home's trim. Tom had even added decorative elements that complemented the house's style. It looks better than I expected, Michael admitted as they inspected the nearly finished work on the second afternoon. Only the final handrails and some landscaping remained to be completed the next day. That evening they received a text from Paul. He had filed a formal complaint with HUD and notified the HOA board of this action. Just strengthening our position, he explained. Keep documenting everything. The following morning, Michael had a doctor's appointment at the VA hospital. It was a standing appointment he couldn't miss. His doctor was monitoring the progression of his condition and adjusting his treatment plan accordingly. Linda drove him, both of them looking forward to returning home to a completed ramp. The appointment ran longer than expected. Michael's doctor was concerned about the increasing weakness in his legs and ordered additional tests, which took several hours. By the time they finished, it was late afternoon. As they turned onto their street, Linda was the first to notice something was wrong. The truck is gone, she said, referring to Tom's company vehicle that should have been parked in front of their house. Maybe they finished early? But as they drew closer, Michael felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The ramp was gone. In its place were broken pieces of aluminum and disturbed soil, where the support posts had been. Several people stood in their front yard, including Elaine Winters, who was directing workers loading debris into a pickup truck. What the hell? Linda gasped, pulling into their driveway and slamming on the brakes. Michael sat frozen in shock, unable to process what he was seeing. The ramp, their access to their own home, the solution they'd fought so hard for, had been destroyed. Linda was out of the car in an instant, rushing toward the group in their yard. What do you think you're doing? She shouted. Elaine turned, a smile of satisfaction spreading across her face. Enforcing our community guidelines, Mrs. Chenin. Unauthorized structures must be removed. That unauthorized structure was a medically necessary accommodation protected by federal law. Linda's voice shook with rage. Our bylaws are very clear, Elaine replied calmly. Section 27, Paragraph 4. The HOA reserves the right to remove any unapproved modifications at the homeowner's expense. You'll be receiving the bill for today's work shortly. Michael had managed to get out of the car, leaning heavily on his walker. He stood in the driveway, unable to climb the steps to his own home, staring at the destruction in disbelief. "How am I supposed to get inside now?" he asked, his voice quiet but carrying across the suddenly silent yard. Elaine barely glanced at him. "That's not the HOA's concern, Mr. Chen. Perhaps you should have considered the accessibility of the property before purchasing in our community." From next door, Joe Perez emerged with his phone held high. "I got everything, Michael," he called out. Been recording since they showed up with the truck. Every word, every action. Only then did Elaine seem to notice they had an audience. Several neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. "This is HOA business," Elaine snapped at them. "There's nothing to see here." "I think there's plenty to see," Rose said from the gathering crowd. "I think we're seeing exactly who you are, Elaine." Elaine turned to the workers. "Finish up here," she ordered, then faced the Chens one last time. "The rules apply to everyone, Mr. and Mrs. Chen, no exceptions." As she walked away, Linda helped Michael to a garden bench where he could sit while she figured out how to get him safely into the house. "I'll call Paul right now," she whispered, her arm around Michael's shoulders. "This changes everything." Joe approached, still recording. "I got it all," he repeated. "Every second from when they arrived with the trucks." She told them to tear it out completely and make sure there's no trace left. Set it right on camera. Michael nodded silently, still processing what had happened. In 30 years of military service through combat zones and hostile territories, he had never felt as violated as he did in that moment, watching a woman in designer clothes smirking as she made his home inaccessible to him. That night, after neighbors had helped Michael up the steps and into his home, he and Linda sat at their kitchen table with Paul on speakerphone. "What happened today changes our approach completely," Paul said, his voice hard with controlled anger. "They've moved beyond simple discrimination to active, willful denial of your federally protected rights." "The video Joe took is damning evidence. What do we do now?" Linda asked, holding Michael's hand tightly. "Now," Paul replied, "we stop asking politely. Now we take this to federal court." As they ended the call, Michael looked out their window at the scattered debris still visible in the fading light. What Elaine and the HOA board didn't understand, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that they hadn't discouraged him. They had awakened something in him, the same determination that had carried him through war zones and 30 years of service. "This isn't over," he said quietly, "not by a long shot." The video of Elaine Winters supervising the destruction of Michael's wheelchair ramp spread through Sycamore Hills like wildfire. By the following morning, most residents had seen Joe's recording, which he'd shared through the neighborhood's private social media group. The footage was undeniable, Elaine clearly directing workers to remove every trace while smirking at Michael stranded in his driveway, unable to enter his own home. The community's reaction was immediate and divided. Many neighbors were outraged, dropping by the Chen's home with offers of help, food, and support. Others, particularly those close to Elaine or serving on various HOA committees, kept their distance, windows closed and blinds drawn against the growing controversy. For 3 days, Michael relied on neighbors to help him navigate the steps. Joe and 2 other veterans from the neighborhood built a temporary wooden ramp, crude but functional, over a single weekend. They worked quickly, finishing before Elaine could organize any opposition. "Let her try to tear this one down," Joe said grimly as they completed the work. "Some of us will be keeping watch." True to his word, a rotation of neighbors maintained a presence near the Chen's home. Lawn chairs appeared on nearby driveways, occupied by residents who claimed to be enjoying the spring weather, while keeping watchful eyes on the property. Meanwhile, Paul Kim had shifted into high gear. He filed a federal lawsuit naming both the Sycamore Hills HOA and Elaine Winters personally as defendants. The legal complaint ran to 27 pages, detailing multiple violations of the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and state civil rights laws. It included claims for intentional infliction of emotional distress and sought both compensatory and punitive damages. "We're not just asking for the right to build a ramp," Paul explained during a strategy meeting at the Chen's kitchen table. "We're seeking damages for the discrimination you've endured, the emotional distress caused, and the outrageous conduct of destroying an accessibility feature for a disabled person. And importantly, we're asking for injunctive relief, a court order that prevents them from interfering with the ramp in the future." The lawsuit made local headlines. A reporter from the city newspaper arrived to interview the Chens, leading to a front-page story complete with photos of Michael using his walker beside the demolished ramp site. The day after the story ran, the Chen's mailbox overflowed with letters of support from across the city. Disabled veterans organizations reached out offering assistance. A prominent civil rights organization contacted Paul, offering to join the case as co-counsel at no cost to the Chens. "This is turning into something bigger than just our ramp," Linda observed, sorting through the letters. "People see it as a fight against discrimination everywhere." Michael nodded, conflicted about the attention but grateful for the support. "If what happened to us can help other people in similar situations, then some good will come from this mess." The HOA board's response to the lawsuit came swiftly. They hired Gregory Phillips, a high-powered attorney known for representing homeowners associations throughout the state. His first action was to file a motion to dismiss the case, arguing that the HOA was simply enforcing its rules consistently for all residents. The Chens were aware of the community guidelines when they purchased their property, Phillips wrote in the motion. Their failure to obtain proper approval before construction began was a clear violation of those guidelines which they agreed to follow when they bought their home. Paul was unfazed when he saw the motion. "Standard operating procedure," he told the Chens. "They're trying to make this about HOA rules rather than federal law. The judge will see through it." The case was assigned to federal Judge Raymond Torres, known for his no-nonsense approach and strict interpretation of civil rights laws. He denied the motion to dismiss in a 7-page ruling that cited numerous precedents, affirming the supremacy of federal disability law over HOA restrictions. The defendant's argument fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between private contractual obligations and federal civil rights protections, Judge Torres wrote. "No homeowner can sign away their rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act or the Fair Housing Act, regardless of what HOA documents they may have signed." With the motion to dismiss rejected, the case proceeded to discovery, the legal process where both sides exchange evidence and information. This phase would prove devastating to Elaine and the HOA board. Through formal requests for documents, Paul obtained years of HOA meeting minutes, emails between board members, and records of previous modification requests. What emerged was a pattern of discrimination that went far beyond the Chen's case. "Look at this," Paul said during another kitchen table meeting, spreading out printed emails. 3 years ago, a family with a child who used a wheelchair requested a ramp. Elaine wrote to the board saying, and I quote, "If we allow one ramp, soon the neighborhood will be overrun with handicap modifications that destroy our aesthetic standards and property values." In another email thread, board members discussed the Chen's application before it was officially submitted. "Another disabled person wanting special treatment," Elaine had written. "Time to slow walk this one like we did with the Thompsons." Most damning was a private email Elaine sent to Patricia after receiving Paul's initial legal letter. "These people need to learn that no one tells me what I can and cannot approve in my neighborhood. Let them waste money on lawyers. I've got the board behind me, and we have deeper pockets than some disabled vet on a fixed income." When these emails became part of the court record, the remaining support for Elaine within the community crumbled. 3 board members resigned, publicly distancing themselves from her comments. The HOA's attorney requested an emergency meeting with Paul to discuss settlement options. "They're running scared," Paul reported to the Chens. "Phillips called me offering to approve your ramp immediately and pay for its construction, but he's still trying to avoid personal liability for Elaine, and they're not offering any compensation for what you've been through." "What do you think we should do?" Michael asked. "I think we should reject it," Paul replied firmly. "The evidence we've uncovered shows this wasn't a misunderstanding or a one-time mistake. This was deliberate discrimination with malice. Judge Torres should see that." As the court date approached, Michael's health took another downturn. The stress of the situation combined with his progressing condition left him relying on his wheelchair most days. Getting in and out of the house remained a daily struggle, even with the temporary ramp. "I just want this to be over," he confessed to Linda one night. "I never wanted to be at the center of a legal battle. I just wanted to be able to enter my own home with dignity." Linda held his hand tightly. "I know. But what they did was wrong, and not just to us. Who knows how many other people they've hurt with their discrimination? Someone needs to stand up to them." The day before the hearing, their doorbell rang. Rose stood on their porch, her hands trembling slightly. "I need to talk to you both," she said once they'd invited her in. "I need to tell you something I should have said weeks ago." Over tea at their kitchen table, Rose revealed that her late husband's request for a wheelchair ramp had also been denied by Elaine 5 years earlier. They had been too intimidated to fight back, instead spending their savings to move to a more accessible home. Her husband had died just months after the move, his final days spent in a strange house rather than the home they'd loved for decades. "I've been carrying this guilt for years," Rose said, wiping tears. "We should have fought back, but we were afraid. When I saw what happened to you, it was like watching our story all over again." "Would you be willing to tell this to the judge?" Paul asked gently. He had arrived earlier to prepare Michael and Linda for the next day's hearing, and had been present for Rose's confession. Rose straightened in her chair. "That's why I'm here. I want to testify. I want to make sure no one else goes through what my Harold did, what Michael is going through now." The courthouse was packed the next morning. News of the case had spread, drawing disability rights advocates, veterans, and curious community members. Even several Sycamore Hills residents showed up. Sitting pointedly on the Chen side of the courtroom, Elaine arrived with her attorney, wearing an expensive suit and a confident expression that faltered when she saw the crowd. For the first time since the Chens had met her, she looked uncertain. Judge Torres entered, and the courtroom fell silent. He was younger than Michael had expected, perhaps in his early 50s, with a methodical manner as he organized his papers and surveyed the packed room. "Before we begin," the judge announced, "I want to make something clear. This courtroom is not concerned with property values, neighborhood aesthetics, or homeowners association politics. This court's only concern is the law, specifically federal civil rights law as it pertains to housing discrimination against persons with disabilities." He looked directly at Elaine and her attorney. "Based on my review of the evidence submitted during discovery, I have serious concerns about the conduct of the defendants in this case. Today I expect straightforward testimony and honest answers. This court has little patience for those who attempt to disguise discrimination behind rules and procedures." As Michael watched the judge's stern expression, he felt a flicker of hope for the first time in months. Someone in authority was finally seeing what they had endured. Someone with the power to make it right was listening. The hearing was about to begin. The courtroom fell silent as the hearing began. Michael sat in his wheelchair beside Linda, both dressed in their most formal clothes. Paul arranged his documents methodically, a stark contrast to the nervous shuffling of papers at the defense table where Elaine and her attorney sat. "The court will first hear opening statements," Judge Torres announced. Beginning with the plaintiffs, Paul stood, his posture relaxed but authoritative. "Your Honor, this case is about one thing: the right of a disabled American veteran to access his own home. Michael Chen served this country honorably for 30 years. He returned home with injuries that have progressively limited his mobility. All he and his wife Linda asked for was a simple accommodation, a wheelchair ramp so he could enter and exit his home safely and independently." Paul gestured toward Elaine. "The defendants not only denied this basic right but deliberately obstructed it. When the Chens proceeded to build the ramp under the protections of federal law, Ms. Winters took it upon herself to have it destroyed, an act of stunning cruelty and clear violation of the Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act." Gregory Phillips then presented the defense's opening statement, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Your Honor, this case is about process, not discrimination. The Sycamore Hills HOA has established procedures for approving modifications, which the plaintiffs failed to follow completely. While the board regrets the unfortunate escalation of this situation, at no point was their intent to discriminate against Mr. Chen's disability." Judge Torres's expression remained neutral, but his questions were pointed. "Counsel, are you arguing that HOA processes take precedence over federal civil rights law?" Phillips hesitated. "No, Your Honor, but we maintain that proper procedures would have eventually led to approval." "Eventually?" the judge repeated, raising an eyebrow. How long is eventually for a disabled person who cannot enter their home? The first witness was Michael. From his wheelchair, he recounted his military service, his medical condition, and the struggle to gain approval for the ramp. His voice remained steady, even when describing the day he returned home to find the ramp destroyed. "How did that make you feel, Mr. Chen?" Paul asked gently. Michael paused, gathering his thoughts. "Helpless," he finally said. "In the military, I led men and women in combat. I made life or death decisions. I served my country proudly. But standing there, unable to climb the steps to my own home while this woman smiled at me." His voice cracked slightly. "I felt helpless in a way I never had before, even after my injury." Phillips's cross-examination attempted to focus on the technicalities of the HOA application process, but Michael's straightforward answers left little room for argument. "Yes, we followed your process. Yes, we provided medical documentation. Yes, we waited 6 weeks. Yes, we tried to call and email. No, we were never given a real opportunity to address concerns," Linda testified next, describing their repeated attempts to work with the HOA and the toll the situation had taken on Michael's health and dignity. Her testimony was followed by Joe's, who shared the video of the ramp's destruction and recounted Elaine's comments. Then came Rose, her voice trembling but determined as she told the story of her late husband. "Harold just wanted to come home from the hospital to the house we'd lived in for 27 years. But because of Ms. Winters and her board, he spent his final months in a strange place away from our memories and our garden that he loved." When Elaine took the stand, her customary confidence had faded. Under Paul's questioning, she struggled to explain emails where she had referred to disabled residents as special needs cases who would lower the neighborhood standards. She denied any discriminatory intent, insisting that her sole concern was maintaining property values. "Ms. Winters," Paul asked, holding up a printed email, "how do you explain your statement here, where you wrote, and I quote, 'I've got the board behind me, and we have deeper pockets than some disabled vet on a fixed income?'" Elaine's face flushed. That was taken out of context. What context would make that statement acceptable, Ms. Winters? She had no answer. After the final witness, Judge Torres called for a 30-minute recess before closing arguments. As court officers cleared the room, Paul leaned over to the Chens. "It's going well," he whispered. "Torres is seeing through their excuses." In the hallway, several Sycamore Hills residents approached Michael and Linda, offering words of encouragement. Even Patricia Collins, the HOA secretary, came over briefly. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I should have spoken up sooner about how Elaine was handling things." When court resumed, closing arguments were brief. Paul emphasized the clear pattern of discrimination and the devastating impact on the Chens. Phillips attempted to minimize Elaine's personal responsibility, suggesting that any errors were procedural rather than discriminatory. Judge Torres listened attentively, occasionally making notes. When both sides finished, he surprised everyone by announcing he would deliver his ruling immediately, rather than taking the case under advisement. "This court sees no reason to delay justice in a matter where the evidence and the law are so clear," he stated, looking directly at the Chens. "Having reviewed all testimony and evidence presented today, I find in favor of the plaintiffs on all counts." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Michael reached for Linda's hand. "The defendants have violated multiple federal laws protecting the rights of persons with disabilities," the judge continued. "Their actions were not merely negligent, but showed willful disregard for Mr. Chen's federally protected rights." Judge Torres outlined his ruling methodically. The HOA would pay for the immediate construction of a new, professional-grade wheelchair ramp. They would cover all the Chen's legal expenses and pay substantial damages for emotional distress. But the judge wasn't finished. Additionally, this court finds that the pattern of discrimination evident in this case requires structural remedies. He ordered the HOA to undergo comprehensive training on fair housing laws and to revise their bylaws to explicitly recognize the rights of disabled residents. A court-appointed monitor would oversee the HOA's compliance with these requirements for 5 years. Then came the most unexpected part of the ruling. Finally, due to the egregious nature of her personal conduct in this matter, this court permanently enjoins defendant Elaine Winters from serving on any homeowners association board or committee. "Effective immediately," Elaine gasped audibly. Her attorney quickly whispered in her ear, but she shook her head in disbelief. This court will not tolerate discrimination disguised as rule enforcement, Judge Torres concluded. The rights of disabled Americans to equal housing opportunity is not a suggestion. It is the law of the land. Court is adjourned. The gavel's sharp crack echoed through the suddenly silent room. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around the Chens. Michael, never comfortable in the spotlight, kept his comments brief and dignified. All we ever wanted was the same right everyone else has, to come and go from our home with dignity. Today's ruling affirms that this right belongs to every American, regardless of disability. Construction on the new ramp began the very next day. The court had ordered the HOA to use the original design from Tom's accessibility company, but with upgraded materials. Within a week, Michael had a beautiful, durable ramp that blended seamlessly with their home's architecture. The fallout within Sycamore Hills was immediate. An emergency HOA meeting was called, and the remaining board members voted unanimously to accept the court's judgment without appeal. Elaine, stripped of her position, put her house on the market 2 weeks later. A new board was elected, with Joe Perez as president and Rose as vice president. Their first official act was to create an accessibility committee to review the neighborhood's common areas and ensure they complied with AD standards. The community center soon had its own ramp and accessible restrooms. The neighborhood pool got a chair lift. Sidewalk repairs, long neglected under Elaine's leadership, were finally addressed to remove hazards for wheelchair users. On a warm Saturday afternoon 2 months after the ruling, the Chens hosted a cookout in their backyard. Nearly half the neighborhood attended, including several residents Michael and Linda had never met before. People kept their distance when Elaine was in charge, Joe explained, flipping burgers on the grill. Nobody wanted to be on her bad side. Things are different now. As the party continued, Michael noticed a young couple touring the house across the street that had just gone on the market. The woman was using forearm crutches, moving carefully across the lawn. New neighbors, maybe, Linda said, following his gaze. Michael smiled. They'll be welcome here. Later that evening, as the last guest departed, Michael sat on their back patio watching the sunset. Linda joined him, resting her hand on his shoulder. "Penny, for your thoughts?" she asked. "I was just thinking about purpose," Michael replied. "When I retired from the army, I thought my days of fighting important battles were over. Turns out I had one more left in me." Linda nodded. "And it might be the most important one. The changes here will help people for years to come." Indeed, the ripples from their case had already spread beyond Sycamore Hills. 2 neighboring communities had proactively revised their HOA bylaws regarding accessibility. A state legislator had reached out to discuss possible amendments to strengthen housing protections for disabled residents. Michael had even been invited to speak at a conference for veterans with disabilities about navigating housing challenges. Not bad for a couple who just wanted a ramp, Michael said, smiling up at his wife as darkness fell over their neighborhood, their home. Michael felt a peace he hadn't experienced since moving to Sycamore Hills. The ramp that had caused so much conflict now stood as a symbol of something larger. The right of every person to belong, to have access, to come home with dignity. It was, he reflected, worth every moment of the fight.